Music 292, Week 7, Part 2, Segmentation and Phrase. In this video, we're going to talk about how to tell where phrases start and end, and we're also going to talk about a related concept called segmentation. Let's get started. First, let me introduce to you some basic vocabulary. A segment is a musical unit with a distinct beginning and ending, and this often is a motive or some other portion of a phrase. So a segment we can think of essentially as our building blocks for other forms of melodic groupings. Smaller segments are often grouped together to form phrases, for example. But segments themselves, in addition to phrases, are established by our perceptions of beginnings and endings. We kind of have to hear it as a unit, and in order to hear it as a unit, we need to know that it's starting and know that it's ending in some kind of way. So what I would like to talk about is what exactly creates the sense of something beginning and what creates the sense of something ending. Well, it turns out there's actually some really basic criteria we can look at in order to establish this. I'm going to present this as two different lists, but essentially these are just two different sides of looking at the same issues. We will hear something as a new beginning if there's substantial change from the previous material. And conversely, we'll hear something as an ending if there's subsequent change into the next material. Substantial change can happen in a lot of different ways. It can be in terms of instrumentation, rhythm, register, articulation, or any of the musical properties that we include in our performances. We hear something as a new beginning if the music is preceded by a rest, or conversely, we hear an ending if the music is followed by a rest. So in other words, a rest provides the gap that separates out our sense of something ending and something beginning anew. We hear something as a new beginning if there's a distinct ending established in the previous material. The most common distinct ending that we're familiar with is the cadence. But there's other types of distinct endings as well. For example, say you've got a descending melodic line, descending down to the tonic would create a sense of ending, even if it's not necessarily a harmonic cadence. And similarly, we hear an ending if there's an established process completed. This is distinct ending just from another perspective. We hear a new beginning if previously heard music is repeated. So if something was a beginning once, and then we hear that same music again, we're going to hear it as a beginning the second time as well. And similarly, if we hear something as an ending once and that music gets repeated, we're going to hear that as an ending again. And lastly, we're going to hear a new beginning if there's something that is an obvious beginning. So, a beginning accent, for example, or some sort of accentuation. And conversely, we'll hear an ending if the next sound is an obvious beginning of a new segment. So what's interesting there is for endings at least, sometimes we don't know something is an ending until we hear the next thing. If we hear a new beginning happening, by default, we must have had an ending previous to that. And so we'll hear it retroactively. Let's take a look at these 5 points in the context of a particular piece. This is a piece that sort of bridges the Renaissance and the classical era. So there's going to be some features that don't quite conform to what you expect. I just want to point out that despite the fact it's only written with one flat, this thing's actually in G minor. And that's because it switches back and forth between E naturals and E flats. I'll also point out about the notation, those little symbols that you're seeing accidentals over top of the notes. These are what's called musica ficta, which you might learn in one of your music history courses. They're essentially just indicating accidentals. So any place that you see the sharp on top of the F, assume that that thing's an F sharp. You'll also see some B flats that have natural signs over them, so those things are B naturals. Let's have a listen. I will point out that I am going to play some things in Baroque pitch in this class because I happen to play early music instruments, and that is the way things go down in the early music universe. So if you do have perfect pitch, I'm very sorry, you're just going to have to deal with it. Carrying on. So taking a look at our criteria for beginnings and endings, we can make a few observations here. I'm going to start by sketching in the harmony because that's going to tell me some important things about where chords are changing, where we have contrast, for example. And it's also going to tell me some things about where the key is changing, which is also a moment of contrast. And so working my way through, I'm going to end up with something that looks somewhat like this. The chords in brackets basically are contrapuntal chords. There is either passing motion or neighbor or something else to that effect. And so we see some substantial moments of contrast here. In particular, when we listen to the recording, you probably noticed in bar 5 that we switch from the minor key to the major key. And that substantial change is going to allow us to hear this moment as a new beginning. Next, rest was one of our properties that allowed us to understand breaks between phrases, or breaks between beginnings and endings. In this particular piece, we only get one rest in the entire thing, and that happens in our first ending. But that's still a signal to us, even though it's only one instrument, that this is a separation. That really we'd have something concluding before this point and something starting again after this point. So although it's not all that substantial a rest, it still tells us useful information. And so because of those two things, we can probably start to sketch out what we think the phrases are in this. I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but we're going to use the slur marking in this course to indicate phrases. And so in this particular case, we've got the contrast of the stuff with B flat. I've decided to include a pickup with that just because that imitates stuff that we've heard previously. We'll talk about that in just a sec. And then this rest is essentially going to show us the ending to show where to end that phrase marking. Let's take a look at repetition next. So you probably noticed a recurring pattern where the rhythm for sure is repeating, and there's actually some melodic repetition here as well. There's also what's called contour repetition, which I'll get to in just a minute. So I bracketed off what the model is for this repetition. I've got some dash brackets in a few places just because when this thing comes back, it varies itself a little bit. And so I'm going to use that broken line notation or dash notation to show when it's not necessarily an exact repetition, but where we might still want to hear something grouped together because of similarities. So for example, the two pickup notes, the G-A, we don't hear that upon the first repetition of the rhythm, but we do hear that at the ending of the first system going back into the second system. Within these repetition patterns, this rhythm da 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 da, you notice there's a particular ending that happens every single time. We've got this acceleration where the music moves into eighth notes. The da 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 pattern happens at the ending of our first model, but it also happens at the ending of each of our repetitions as well. Da 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 da. Although the pitch does change in those contexts. What's interesting is that that portion of our repetition comes back in one more place. And that's at the beginning of bar 7. We get this ending pattern without the preceding long notes that we expect to introduce that. And that's telling us something about the music. It's telling us that this thing is coming to a conclusion of some kind. This is a previously established ending. This is a distinct ending that was established in our model and our two repetitions. So when we hear it come back, we know this thing is signaling an ending, even though it hasn't had the introducing material. The shape of this thing, in other words, the contour. So when I use the word contour, what I mean is the shape of the melody and the direction that it's moving, not necessarily the exact size of the intervals, but the ups and downs relative to one another. This last statement of this ending pattern is an inversion of the original ending pattern. Inversion means you flip the ups and downs. So what was up originally now becomes down and vice versa. So there's a clear relationship actually between this final ending pattern and the one that was established earlier in the piece. Lastly, on our list, we had the idea of obvious repetition or obvious new beginning. And in this case, there's a really, really obvious sign that we've got a repetition or new beginning happening. And that is the fact we have a literal repeat sign in the music. This tells us as performers, go back to the beginning. And we can take that into account in terms of our analysis. I'll also point out, notice that I've analyzed both the first ending and the second ending. You're going to need to do this in your piece as well because there might be differences between those two endings that impact how you understand the structure of your music. So that's just a short example of how to take these theory concepts and apply them to real music in order to figure out where things like phrases start and end. In our next video, we're going to take a look at a concept called focal pitch, which, as you might expect, focuses on pitch. I'll see you in the next video.